From the initial announcement of Alienware's new concept handheld device, dubbed the UFO, many Nintendo Switch fans have been comparing the two. And while we do know the UFO is definitely going to be more powerful than the Switch, it's also going to likely be about $500 more expensive. So bear that in mind. But let's break the two consoles down anyway and see how they compare. And more importantly, which one's cooler? The UFO has had a lot of pointers based off some of the failures of the Nintendo Switch. You know, like the flip stand and short battery life. So it's no surprise that Alienware has capitalized on what a lot of Switch fans wanted from an improved version. Take for instance how the UFO features a stand that covers the whole back. Compared to the Switch's kickstand, this gives the whole console way more support, so you won't have to worry about a gust of wind blowing it over. The Joy-Cons on the Switch were often seen as the main selling point with the Switch. That was the whole idea of calling it Switch. And while they were definitely comfortable, they didn't offer a whole lot of support, and did struggle to fit all hand sizes. Alienware basically took the Joy-Con idea in its entirety and made their own twist. They sculpted the controllers on the UFO to feel like an Xbox controller with the curved edges, as well as making the thumbstick and all the buttons bigger. Then again, it is easier for them to make more ergonomic controllers because the whole console is bigger. The screen is 8 inches alone, which is 2 inches larger than the Switch's. This is great for a better gaming experience, but does take away from the portability aspect. The overall shape is probably less convenient to transport because it's not a perfect rectangle like the Switch, but actually a series of sharp hexagon edges intended to replicate that alienistic spacecraft look. So basically, it's unlikely to be able to fit in your pockets. Although, having said that, the width of the UFO is no thicker than the Switch, so you will absolutely be able to wrap your hands around it. Conclusively, the UFO is a lot larger, heavier, and a lot more ergonomic to hold for a number of reasons. But it's not going to match the Switch's maneuverability for that very reason. There's also the case of the docking systems for each console as well. For the Switch, we all know how controversial the dock is, because it's essentially just a big pointless hunk of plastic with few functions aside from scratching the Switch's screen on the way in. It really didn't add enough extra functions to please the Nintendo fans. Which is a shame, because it seems like a real missed opportunity. A lot of Switch gamers longed for a docking system which added some kind of upscaling tech, so we could play those gorgeous Nintendo games like Zelda in 4K. The UFO does feature a docking system, but right now, little is known about it. It might add upscaling functions to it, but we can't be sure. However, we do know that the actual console itself will have 2 Thunderbolt USB-C ports on the top and bottom. This means it can be connected up to a separate screen or even a mouse and keyboard. Basically, we can't be sure of anything when it comes to what hasn't been mentioned. But we can deter that from what we know already, it will try to capitalize on some of the Switch's biggest issues. And essentially, it's going to be what we envisioned a Nintendo Switch Pro might have looked like. Nintendo and Alienware are 2 gaming companies that offer 2 very different experiences. On one hand, you got Alienware, which uses Windows. Then on the other, Nintendo has its own operating system. As we know, Alienware will follow suit with the UFO, so it will be a fully fledged handheld Windows device. This immediately gives the UFO a massive advantage over the Switch, because it means it'll have more games at launch than the Switch does right now. Of course, the Switch has Nintendo exclusive games, like Zelda and Mario, but if the UFO does actually have full-on Windows support, then the likelihood is that you could probably use an emulator to play those Switch exclusives anyway, as well as having more games. Having Windows opens up a whole host of opportunities. I mean, you don't have to pay a subscription for online services for starters, but it also means that games could very well be moddable. Of course, that does depend on whether the console can run modded games, because it is only small after all. It could also mean that you could play your Xbox games through the Xbox app as well, which technically makes this an Xbox handheld gaming device. And hey, I'm all for that. Essentially, the advantage the UFO has is that with Windows, it's just going to be a much more fluid and versatile device. However, it can also just as easily be a problem, since Windows is made for a full-size screen and is meant to be controlled by keyboard and mouse. So how they'll tackle that is a big question, because best believe it's going to be fiddly trying to navigate Windows using a thumbstick. That's one thing the Switch has over the UFO, because the Switch actually has a designated user interface that works seamlessly with the controls. You also gotta think that the Switch's audience is gonna be made up by a lot lighter gamers, so having a more simple, intuitive interface is important to them, I guess. With the two consoles pitted together, it's essentially a case of one offering more advanced features, that being the UFO, and the Switch offers a more simple and friendly gaming-oriented experience. One is not better than the other, because they offer experiences far too different to be all that comparable. But I will say that the UFO, you should be able to access a whole lot more games than the Switch. Specs are clear-cut here, because the UFO is bigger and newer, so it's going to be better in that regard. Full stop. The screen for the UFO is 1920 by 1200, which is pretty much just full HD. The Switch's screen is 720p. Obviously, the UFO has higher resolution, but it is also bigger, so how much different they'll actually look is certainly questionable. Little else is known about the screen though, aside from it being 8 inches in diameter. That's 2 inches larger than the Switch's 6-inch screen. Little else is known about the internals of the UFO, aside from the CPU being some kind of 10th gen Intel. And we assume the graphics card is going to be better, because demo games prove to play with much better graphical performance than the Switch. Other specs like RAM are likely to be 8 or 16 gigabytes, and we can only hope for more than 128 gigabytes of SSD space. The Switch battery lasted about 3 hours with demanding games like Zelda, Breath of the Wild, so with the UFO, we can probably expect about the same or less. But it won't be anything above that, given the average battery life of most gaming laptops is about 2. So what can we gather from all of this? Well, the Switch may very well have a potential rival soon. But the UFO is just a concept right now, so I wouldn't hold on to that. If it does get an actual release, then the chances are it will cost near to $1,000 as compared to the $300 Switch, so they will definitely appeal to two different types of people. On one hand, the UFO is bigger and more capable device. Then on the other, the Switch is a more light gaming device for less serious gamers. Having said that though, the Switch is a solid contender against the likes of Xbox and PS4 because of the unique gaming experience it offers and the excellent Nintendo exclusives. So even if the UFO does become a reality, it's very unlikely to take over the Switch in the handheld gaming market. It's just too niche down to really have a widespread appeal. But it would certainly be interesting to see how a more premium Switch-like console would fare against the avid Nintendo fans. It would be especially cool to see Alienware capitalize on the Switch's biggest shortcomings and essentially make a more finished design and hopefully a much more ergonomic one. Anyway, what did you think? Let me know in the comments below, and please remember to like the video. Also, don't forget to subscribe.